Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel and my series that I'm calling Barely-Vangelical. If you've seen any of the previous entries, you'll know what this is about, but if you haven't, what I'm doing or trying to do with these videos is walk you through my personal journey in which I grew up in a pretty conservative, evangelical culture and background, deconstructed much of it, and then actually I am a Christian. I'm actually a Christian pastor now, so I'm just walking through my journey, but specifically with each video I'm trying to target a particular aspect of evangelical. Of course, that's an incredibly broad and nebulous term, but I'm still going to use it for just for the purposes of my videos, and I'll keep trying to define that as we go. But I'm trying to target a specific aspect of evangelical teaching or doctrine or maybe culture, and just walk through my journey with it. And so this video is going to be about a topic that was super lightning rod hot button 10, 20 years ago. Not so much anymore, but I think still a lot of people, at least people my age, had to go on a journey with it. And that topic is the topic of evolution / science / the age of the earth / especially the Genesis account of the creation, and just how do we integrate or not integrate these things as it may. Just what does that all look like? That's the journey I want to put out there today. That kind of touches all of those things I just listed and probably a few others as well. And so what I'm going to do, my format for these videos is I start with my inheritance. I kind of follow a threefold pattern. I like what I inherited, what the deconstruction looked like, resources that I was kind of wrestling with in that process of asking questions and unpacking it, and then the kind of new thing I've come to. So, you can think about it as order, disorder, reorder, however words you want to use, but the inheritance I got, the deconstruction, and then the position I'm in now. So I'm going to walk you through that, just like I have with these other videos that I've done, and hopefully find something interesting. My hope is that these videos give you, if nothing else, they give you an example of a journey that someone has gone on. I hope that some of it resonates with you if you've had similar questions or similar kind of wrestling matches or tensions in your spiritual life and your faith walk, whatever that's looked like for you. So I'm just going to put this out there, and hopefully you'll find something you can relate to in it. But let's dive in before I keep giving more of an intro. Okay, so the situation I grew up in, the setting I grew up in, the culture I grew up in was quite traditionally conservative, evangelical, very kind of straight down the line. More so than just the church I grew up in, although that was within that culture, obviously, but just the school. I went to a public school, but it was in a very small, very culturally conservative, very broadly Christian town in a rural part of the country. And so I just was kind of immersed in that way of being. And one of the things as it relates to this topic, my inheritance, the thing that I inherited kind of by default, honestly, and that's one of the first points I want to make, is that I don't think, to be really honest, I was racking my brain about this, and I cannot remember, certainly not as a kid, I cannot remember being explicitly taught a young earth kind of ideology about the Bible and Genesis and all of that. I cannot remember. It may have happened in a Sunday school class when I was a little kid, or it may have somewhere along the line. I picked it up somewhere, but I can't remember any explicit teaching event, which speaks to the culture I was in. I think I absorbed it almost by osmosis, but I kind of just inherited this default, and it's kind of fed by a common sense or quote plain sense reading of Genesis, right? Which is also an approach. That's a particular approach to the text that was very much in the atmosphere for me. And that plain sense reading led towards that kind of almost common sense conclusion that the earth is young and that the creation week was an actual week. Adam and Eve were the first people, and the logical kind of implication of that was that they were there with dinosaurs, right? All of that stuff, which just kind of assumed in my mind. Also, as a kid, just incidentally, I was obsessed with dinosaurs as a kid, and I read as much as I could about dinosaurs, and that it was just kind of this compartmentalized part of my brain. Part of it's odd because in part of my brain, even as a kid, I can remember being as young as 5 years old, 6 years old, and just a part of my brain knew that dinosaurs, or believed or thought that dinosaurs were just not on the earth with humans. And then this other part of my brain had this young earth kind of default assumption in it, and I just never as a kid tried to fix those two together somehow. So it's just an odd little experience that I had. Anyways, that was maybe a little idiosyncratic to me and my childhood interests, but there you go. So I just inherited this young earth idea without maybe being even explicitly taught it anywhere. Now, I have a very specific memory in high school. I was a ninth grader. I was a freshman in high school. And somewhere along the line, maybe in middle school, I started to just not be sure. Maybe that whole dinosaur compartmentalized fragmentation thing in my brain wasn't holding up anymore. And I was super interested in science, just all the way through, adolescence. And at some point, some like tensions started to appear in my mind. Some cracks started to form in this young Earth kind of idea. And I might have verbalized it to other people. I literally don't remember, but I have a very strong memory because it was traumatic would be too strong of a word to put it, but it was definitely damaging. I had a very strong memory of asking an upperclassman who I really looked up to and respected at the time. I was a freshman. I think he was a senior. And I remember verbalizing tentatively saying like, is it possible that Genesis is a bit more poetic, and the earth might not have literally been created in 7 24-hour days? And I kind of was like hedging some of those questions, those experiences where you kind of put something out there and you kind of gauge the person's reaction if they're a safe person to talk to. It's kind of what I was doing, even though I didn't realize it at the time. And he slammed the door down on that conversation and just said very, very, very matter-of-factly, forcefully, if Genesis says it was 7 days, it was 7 days, and you have no business questioning that. Kind of a who are you to even like bring that up, one of those interactions. And wow, that it still sticks with me. I can remember exactly where we were when we had that conversation. And it just goes to show, if you're a person who is in spiritual ministry leadership, it goes to show that when you react forcefully to things, you just never know what kind of memories you're creating in people and what kind of things are going to stick. So that was pretty significant, interaction for me, and he probably literally doesn't even remember it. But nevertheless, that kind of encouraged me, would be a mild way to put it, to stuff those questions into kind of my psychological closet. Put those away. Don't get those out. And that's the last time I remember. That's the last memory in high school I have of even dealing at all with the subject. Now, again, it probably happened more. I probably actually had conversations with people that didn't react that way, and I don't remember them. I don't know, but I remember that one. And so then, move forward a bit. This is still in the inheritance I have. I have never examined it yet. That's the key thing there. Is like, because of that interaction, the signals I got from that interaction, I got these loud and clear signals like, don't examine it. Sadly. So I didn't. And then I went to a small private evangelical Christian university for undergrad. And interestingly, that place was actually very safe to talk about this stuff. And I found a group of friends in which this wasn't an offensive issue. And I started to explore it. I started to at least explore it in conversation and in reflection. There were some safe academic, some teachers, some academics at the school that were very fine talking about this stuff. And so somewhere in college, I kind of almost implicitly or almost by default, in reaction to the harsh kind of way it was treated in my high school years, I kind of then took on this old earth view of science, like this old earth view of the age of the earth. But just because it felt, I think what was motivating me at the time, there's an Augustine quote about science, actually, and about how important it is that Christians don't speak foolishly about matters that other people are experts in, because of the sake of our witness. We don't want to be, basically he says, if we are seen to be fools in something that a non-Christian is an expert in, then and we speak about it in a foolish manner, then there's no way they're going to trust us when we speak about matters of our beliefs when it comes to Christ or the scriptures. And so for him, that was an apologetic for actually understanding science well, or other matters, history, other matters, like understanding them well so that we are well spoken and so that we can be trusted to speak about matters of faith. And so I did not know that quote at the time, although when I discovered that quote, it really, really resonated with me. I did not know that quote at the time, but that was kind of what I was kind of searching for, was that mindset. And so I found in high school, the point I'm trying to get to here is that in college, that I found that the explanations of the age of the earth from that scientific viewpoint that explained it as much older than the 4,000 to 6,000 years I was kind of assumed, those explanations just made sense. And frankly, the ones that were trying to say it was young felt foolish to me. And so I just adopted the ones that didn't feel foolish. Now, I'm not saying this was the healthiest way to go about it, because it still wasn't a very rigorous or self-reflective or carefully examined move. It was kind of almost a gut level, like this feels like it makes more sense to me. I'm just going to take this on. And so what I'm trying to point out here is kind of the shifting ways these things go about, depending on the community that you're in, depending on who the safe people are that you're around. And also what it can look like to take on different views, almost like to try them on socially or maybe somewhat intellectually, but without really rigorous examination, because I had not rigorously examined any of this stuff yet, and I definitely did not go back to the text of Genesis. That's another point I'm trying to make. I took on this scientifically plausible kind of view of things without going back to the text of Genesis and really even asking, what's Genesis doing, and is this actually possible to integrate with this scientific understanding, the scientific consensus I'm kind of taking on now? I just didn't really answer or seek those answers at the time. And so that's where I kind of found myself, even graduating from college on this issue. Now, there's one more specific experience I want to recount before I move into my deconstruction, because this played into it. This was kind of the hinge point for me. I went right into 2 years of grad school right after my undergrad. I graduated in 2008 from undergrad and went straight into graduate school. And I got involved with a campus ministry at my graduate school, which was a big state school in Indiana. So it was not a Christian school. I got involved with the ministry group. I had a very good experience with the ministry group, but there was one experience with them that stuck with me in this issue, and we did, at the time, I think it was, I should have looked up the year before I started the video. I think it was 2009, in which was the 150th anniversary of the publication of On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. It was either 2009, 2010, something like that. It was right in there. It was the 150th anniversary, and so this campus ministry that I was part of set up a table outreach in the quad of the campus to hand out copies of On the Origin of Species. And I thought, this is great. This is like demonstrating our intellectual confidence as Christians on campus. We're going to hand out this book to anyone for free, to anyone who wants it. And hopefully it'll spark up conversations like, why is a Christian group handing out Darwin's text? And I was really excited about it, and I signed up and I helped. Now, I took one of the copies of it home, and when I got back to my apartment, I looked at the cover, and it said, with a new foreword by Ray Comfort. If you know who Ray Comfort is, you know where this is going. I did not know who Ray Comfort was at the time. And so I thought, that's interesting. Is he a scientist? Is he a Christian? Like, who is this Ray Comfort? So I opened the book, and I read the foreword, and I was horrified by what I had read and then what that meant for what I had just participated in. Because Ray Comfort is this extremely conservative, is one way to put it, apologist. He's known for things like The Way of the Master, and I have since learned. And he's very, at least at the time, he was very stridently opposed to evolution, to older thinking, to Darwin, anything Darwin or Darwinian. And so this foreword to On the Origin of Species basically is a lot of very shallow kind of pop science refutations of the text on the origin of species. And so we had just handed out on campus these copies of this book with this foreword in it that was bundled up as kind of a gotcha, like it was a gotcha trick. And I just was mortified. I did not had any idea that this is what I just participated in. And that sent me at that point, this was like the hinge point in my story where I was like, okay, I got to get to the bottom of this issue. I got to figure out what I really think, why I think it. I got to be able to defend it. And and I want to understand what Genesis is saying too. Like, I want to understand science. I want to understand Genesis. I want to understand how these things can be integrated, because I believed that they could be. And so that sent me into my real full-on kind of deconstruction of my inheritance. So that's my story of the first part. Now I'm just going to rip through some of what I studied. And my journey at this point takes an interesting turn at kind of the very end. So hang in there if you're interested in this topic. But here's some stuff that I studied. Okay, a huge book for me, as probably is for a lot of other people, because I know it's pretty popular, is The Lost World of Genesis 1 by John Walton. It was published in 2009. I didn't read it till a few years later. I think it was around 2012-ish when I read it. I still love this book. I think it's still my favorite of the Lost. There's a whole series of them now by John Walton and various co-authors. But this one's still, I think it's my favorite, partly because of the experience I had when I first read it. It was so amazingly revelatory. And what John Walton does in this book is very methodically go through, it's a literal series of propositions. He goes through the language, the genre of Genesis. He compares it to other ancient Near Eastern accounts of creation. And he very calmly and with much poise and clarity of thought, walks you through his interpretation of Genesis, which is to say he does not believe Genesis is posing a material origins account. He doesn't think Genesis is about the creation of the stuff. The stuff meaning matter, rocks, dirt, all of that, animals on up to humans. He thinks Genesis 1 is about the way that God ordered creation. That creation that may have pre-existed in his account, may have pre-existed for any length of time, like an indeterminate amount of time. So his view opens up the possibility for a vastly old material earth, but maintains this, maintains a very confident view that there was a period of time in which God ordered it. And I think John Walton actually thinks it was an actual week. Like, I think he holds open that possibility, which is really interesting. It's why he doesn't quite fit into any of these buckets that I had seen go after each other before, which is part of why I loved that book so much. So it just opened up, and there's a lot of stuff, interesting stuff about the Hebrew language and the linguistic kind of poetic tricks that are happening in Genesis. It's really still a great book. I know that it has its detractors, but it's a great book. So that played a big role in my study. Another book that is much more obscure is called The Bible, Rocks, and Time, and it's co-written by a few scientists, mostly geologists, and it's not the easiest book to read because it's quite long and it's quite dry. It's quite staid and like methodical, but it very patiently walks through, strictly from a geological perspective, the overwhelming ways in which, basically all of the ways in which the rocks that we walk on, the rocks of our earth, reveal an old earth. And like, it's consistent across every metric, every method, every type of geologic approach. It's why it's co-written by multiple scientists. They go through a ton of stuff. I learned a ton reading that book. From all kinds of different, one very specific thing I remember from it, it's been years since I read it, but I remember it's full of these little insights. Like one thing it walks you through is how long it takes lava to cool, rocks that we know were once lava, how long it takes the lava to move there and to cool to become what we see, and how that requires a certain amount of time. And it's just like, it's chock full of just example after example after example of things like that, in my view, pose this just sheer overwhelming force of evidence revealed by creation itself. So that's another really interesting tool. I also learned about Bishop Ussher, who is widely accredited with establishing the young Earth timeline. He calculated in a very, actually, I'll say more about him in my conclusion, but in a very extensive project, he calculated the date of creation to be in the year 4004 BC. Calculated it with quite an amount of precision. So I learned about him, and I learned that he was, in many ways, it would be way too simplistic to just say it's because of Bishop Ussher, it's because of young Earth creationism. But in a lot of ways, his calculations are kind of a fountainhead or kind of a source of a lot of this thinking. Now, it's also true, I learned this from the Bible, Rocks, and Time, it's also true that for a lot of creation, there was kind of this assumed age of the Earth, young age of the Earth thing that no one had ever really calculated or really with scientific rigor or historical rigor figured out. It was assumed that the Earth was around 6,000 to 7,000 years old for lots of historical reasons. So that is true. It was a more of a modern thing to discover. Even just the notion of this is a little bit of a tangent, but it's relevant. This kind of blew my mind when I learned this through my own reading. But the idea that there were species that went extinct, that was a mind-blowing thing for humanity writ large to even realize, because it wasn't an assumed thing, that there could be species that would actually be gone and not around anymore. That was actually a scientific discovery in itself that has implications for how old the Earth is. But if you don't even have any of that on your radar collectively as humanity, then you're not really going to assume the Earth is that old, I think. So anyways, I was learning about all of this stuff in all of my reading. At the time, a few years go by. This is basically covering a period from 2010 to about, well, I'll come up till quite recently. But somewhere around 2013, 14, 15, I discovered BioLogos, I think through John Walton. BioLogos is a really interesting resource of Christian scientists and philosophers who write, many of them write books like John Walton is on the board of BioLogos, I believe, or at least he was. Biblical studies folks, scientists, they write a lot of essays on biologos.org about lots of scientific matters that are very interesting. There's a lot of really good academic and scientific work there. So I just was reading BioLogos a lot, tons of their essays, And then I read a book called, and I still have it on my shelf, called Adam and the Genome, which was co-written by a theologian, Scot, whom I really like, and a scientist named Dennis Venema, who I had never heard of. But Adam and the Genome is this case that it's written in two halves. The first half is this like presenting the genomic evidence, the kind of genetic DNA evidence for essentially for evolution, but also for this idea Dennis Venema believes that the Earth, the population of humanity, in order to have the genetic diversity that we have, that the population could have never been less than 10,000 humans at one point. That's like the smallest choke point of the population. That's what his scientific kind of evidence pointed to. And so he lays out his case in the first chapters of that book just for the science, and then Scot McKnight lays out a case for a theological kind of take on that. What do we do with Adam? What do we do with what Paul says about Adam in Romans, if that's the case? If Adam and Eve were never the only two humans at one point, according to this genetic theory, what do we do theologically? That's what the book is about. Now, I was really excited to read this book, given all the journey that I've been through, and I read it, and I thought it was okay. I didn't really love it. I thought the science was very interesting. I actually thought the first half was better than the second half, to be honest, which surprised me because I like Scot McKnight a lot. And I found the scientific evidence super interesting and very persuasive. I'm also not a scientist, so who am I to rebut what a scientist like him is laying out? But he laid it out very clearly, very lucidly, and it made sense to me. And I thought, okay, I guess this is the case. I guess there were never less than 10,000 humans. But the theological work in the second half of the book was less than compelling to me. It didn't make sense to me. It felt like some kind of sloppy uses of concepts. It felt like there was a little bit of hand-waving that happened. It just didn't quite tie things together in a way I was hoping for. So I put the book down and I thought, oh, that's a little disappointing. Maybe it just wasn't Scot McKnight's best work. I don't know. But where I'm at this point, I'm about to come to my turn. It's a little bit of a twist that may be unexpected. But where I'm at this point, even given the experience of reading Adam and Genome, but where I'm at this point is, and actually there are other books. Pete Enns wrote a book on Adam, which I read. There's a textbook I have that's co-written by John Walton about various theories of origins. There's a ton out there. So I had read all this stuff, immersed in biologos, and I came to the point that was essentially, I would say I was quite certain in a weirdly fundamentalistic way that the Earth was absolutely old. There was absolutely no convincing me of any other possibility. That was that. The matter was settled. Anyone who's defending young Earth at this point is just intellectually vapid and foolish, and we need to get away from that as much as possible as Christians if we're going to have any sort of intellectual merit and respect in our world today. That's where I was at. I'm not exactly proud of that mentality because that's a very contemptuous or borderline contemptuous mentality. And there are very smart people who hold to young Earth. There are very smart people with PhDs in things like geology or astrophysics who hold to young Earth. And so, it's not a matter of how smart you are, which is kind of the mentality I was taking to it, which is not, I don't think is helpful. But that's where I was. And that, I want to say that to set up the turn that my story took after that, from that position. And that turn was when I read Josh Swamidass's book, The Genealogical Adam and Eve. This is an amazing book. And I think anyone with even a passing interest, or if your story resembles mine at all and you haven't read this book, you got to read this book. This book kicked open a door in my brain in more ways than one. So essentially what Swamidass's book is about is he takes major issue with Dennis Venema and others who have this mentality supported by genetics that there were never less than 10,000 humans on the Earth. He takes a sledgehammer to that view in this book. And he very calmly and with much poise and confidence lays out the problems with that view. And the problem comes down to the difference between genetics and genealogy. This was super interesting to me, and I did not understand this. And it retroactively gave me a lot of language for what my discomfort was with the Adam and the Genome book, actually. And so the difference between genetics and genealogy is so simple but so profound in the sense that we all have genealogical ancestors that we do not have any genetic material from. Such a simple point, and it's obvious when you think about it. I have people that I have descended from in my genealogical tree that nevertheless I have not inherited any genetic material from those people. And this has to do with the way that family trees map out and certain population growths. lots of our meaning like humanity's genealogies overlap in lots of ways, but that we don't actually have genetic material from. So to rely overly on genetic material, what we can read in our DNA, and to map out a population map from just genetic material is to miss all the genealogical material, right? And this is why Swamidass is so forceful in his argumentation, because he thinks that it is a massive, and I think he's right, he's persuasive, it's a massive mistake to rely merely on genetic material to make some of these arguments, and then to build a theology off of it like the book Adam and the Genome did is like putting an error on top of an error, which is why it's such a problem. And so that book single-handedly kind of demolished that argument in my mind. It answered why I had some, I think, latent discomfort with it, why it didn't quite make sense to me. And so what Swamidass lays out in his book is, and he lays it out with scientific rigor to the extent that non-Christian scientists have endorsed and put their stamp of approval on his work because the science checks out. His work checks out. And his work points to the reality that it is possible and actually likely that somewhere between 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, all of humanity could descend from a couple. All of humanity genealogically, not genetically, by measurement of genetic material, but genealogically, we could come from the same place within 4,000 to 6,000 years. That science checks out, which completely rocked my world when I read that. Completely rocked my world. Now, Swamidass does not have an axe to grind when it comes to the age of the earth. He doesn't get into that in that book. In many ways, his argument leaves that question pretty open, which is something I love about it. He leaves that question open, but he really hits home that there's a lot of bad science that's propping up bad theological or bad scriptural arguments, saying things like there were never less than 10,000 humans, or these like minimum population sizes that we all descend from, because they're just getting off on the wrong foot by using genetics and not genealogy. And it's an amazing book, and it turned me, and it shifted me, and it also it chastened and corrected my kind of contemptuous, semi-arrogant view of people who had this young Earth kind of approach, which was really a little bit, disgruntling, but also in the long run very helpful. So I credit Swamidass for having a huge impact in kind of my view of this particular issue. So, and this sets me up. That's all of my deconstruction exploration, and this sets me up for kind of where I'm at today. At this point, I am an old earther open-handedly. I do think, like that book about geology and genealogy coming together here, that book about geology, I think holds. There's also a lot like atomic spectra. There's astrophysicists who measure atomic spectra and stuff that also point to a much older creation than just the young Earth idea. So I think an intellectually humble position actually just acknowledges that there is this preponderance of evidence all around us from all different spheres of creation that point to it being old. And so that's what I would hold to. But I don't hold to it with a zeal or an anger, hopefully, or a contempt that I might have at one point. But that also brings me back to what is Genesis doing. And I have come to the point through by way of Walton and some others. I'm actually currently reading Marilyn Robinson's wonderful book on reading Genesis. But Robert Alter, like a lot of people I've talked about before who take a more of a holistically biblical and literary approach to these texts. I am very much in that camp, and I think that Genesis is certainly not trying to give a rigorous modernistic scientific account of material origins. And I think that it is perfectly harmonizable with an older Earth in ways buttressed by Josh Swamidass's work. Because what his work does for me is it gives a layer of possibility that there is a recency in what Genesis is talking about when it comes to a possible historic Adam and Eve figure who did possibly an historic act that Christians would and also Jews would hold unleashed, brought into the world sin, chaos, disorder, death, evil. That this couple somehow they did something that released something not good into the world, and that we are all inherited from them, and we inherit the world in its state it's in because of what happened in that time, and that could have happened 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. That's kind of where I'm at now. Is I think that the Earth reveals an old Earth, and also, by the way, there's a theological layer here about like God making creation. Is God's creation trustworthy to reveal truths about itself, and what are the implications for God and God's character if, for example, if God created creation and created us to be inquisitive, to only be revealing lies, like if dinosaur bones are just put in there to make the earth look old, but it's not actually old. I think some of those arguments get into really weird theological territory that, and nevertheless, that's a little bit of a tangent. I think that the preponderance of evidence, like I said, of the earth reveals an old earth, but I think that Swamidass is helpfully gives a layer in which we can come back, in a second naivete kind of way, come back to a kind of historically recent understanding that Genesis is capturing something that happened within 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, I think. I think that's probably what's going on there, that was handed down through oral tradition until it was codified at some point and written down and preserved in a text. Of something that happened within that time span that we all are inheritors of. And I think that's the deeper anthropological truth that Genesis is getting at, is that we are all inheritors of whatever this thing is that happened with this couple or this figure or this figurehead of humanity that may or may not have been a particular couple or two people within a broader set of hominids, maybe, that were, if you believe in God and God's act in creation, maybe these particular people were granted a certain, they were elected in a certain way, kind of prefiguring the way that maybe people like Abraham were elected, right? Chosen and given a task to perform, and they failed in that task, which also is repeated in the stories, right, of Israel on down the line until Jesus is the one who is given a task and actually completes it. Anyway, that's me getting on a theological tangent, but I think it makes sense to me to see Adam and Eve as the first ones of that pattern in humanity. And I think it makes sense to me that they could have happened within that time period I just mentioned. That's more recent than some of the biologos or old Earth interpretations would have. And I think the material origins of the Earth could be billions of years ago. That's where I'm at, which is a complicated, multi-layered position that doesn't fit neatly into the young Earth, old Earth dichotomy I was given as a child. But I think that's okay. That's a lot of, maybe a theme of a lot of these videos, is I come to this more complicated place that affirms some aspects of my inheritance while affirms new aspects that I came to through study and question. And so last thing I want to say here, I just want to say one more thing before I wrap this video up. I think evolutionary theory has so much explanatory power. See my interview with Drew Johnson and my review of his book, What Hath Darwin to Do with Scriptures. I think that evolutionary theory has a lot of value that we can learn from in an intellectually humble posture. We meaning Christians, people of faith, really anybody. I think evolutionary theory has a lot to say that's very interesting and potentially very helpful. I think it in many cases overplays its hand when it comes to asserting philosophical ideas or metaphysical ideas about who we are, what our purpose is in this planet, having categories like sin and evil and death. I don't know that evolutionary theory does the best job at that. I don't know that it can. But I have less of a kind of angsty relationship with that at this point. And what I want to come back to actually is that I think much of evolutionary theory is harmonizable with the things I was talking about with Genesis. And I actually want to come back to that figure, Bishop Ussher. I said I would come back to him. I'm going to end on him. Because when I went on, at first when I learned about Bishop Ussher, I just kind of dismissed him as like, oh, well, he must be a crackpot that, all these young earthers love because he calculated the age of the earth, and so I'm just not going to pay attention to him. That was that contemptuous attitude I had. When I learned more about him, though, I learned he was quite brilliant, and his project, actually, of dating the earth, his project was multidisciplinary. He was very intellectually serious. He was a very rigorous kind of person, and his date was a combination of a lot of serious historical research and work, and what he was trying to do was actually make the case that all that we see revealed around us in all these different fields of history and archaeology and geology and all that stuff, all of it is coherent. He was trying to make a case that it's coherent and that it's harmonizable with Scripture and that these things shouldn't be pitted against each other. And he wanted to use the best examples of quote-unquote secular research in things like archaeology to support his point, because he was so confident that these things could be unified. And I actually love that mindset. I actually respect that mindset. And I think, here's my potentially provocative assertion here, I think that Bishop Ussher would be so grieved to know how his date has been used in a dogmatic ideological sense to affirm this young earth kind of stubborn young earth view. Because what he modeled is, I think, an intellectually open and curious pursuit of truth that wanted to use the best of what's available all around him to understand how the scriptures account for what's most deeply true about creation and about humanity. I think that's what his posture was and his modeling was, and I think it's really sad and unfortunate that his findings are being used in many cases are being used in exactly the opposite kind of posture, which is not intellectually curious, which is not looking to use the best of what's available in terms of tools of analysis around us. So I actually want to bring Bishop Ussher's mindset back. I want us as Christians, people of faith who are interested in science and history and research and study, to think like him, actually, and to read widely, understand widely, pursue questions widely from all sources, but with a confident and trusting posture that truth can be revealed. And it will be harmonizable with Scripture. I really do believe that. So there you go. I'm going to stop myself before I keep rambling on. This video is about the length I was hoping it would be. But that's my story. That's my story with this particular issue. Again, I know it's not a lightning rod, hot button issue like it was years ago. But nevertheless, I think people my age, around my age or older, might find something in my story to resonate with or to wrestle with that might maybe helpfully put some language to something that you've been through. So if you resonate with this, I'd love to hear what your experience is like. If you have other resources I didn't mention, books, thinkers I didn't mention that you think would be really helpful recommendations, I would love for you to post those below. I think other people watching this would probably be interested in that too. But as always, thank you so much for taking some time to watch.